afternoon, everybody. My name's Tasnmeen Chopa, and I'm delighted to be the host of this next session, which is Springboarding, the idea of diversity and inclusion into your workplace. And I'm really excited to have two guests with me. But before I introduce those panelists, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon where we're all meeting from across the country and I believe from overseas potentially, acknowledging the elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging again that this land always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. My name's Tasnmeen Chopa. I'll be the host for this panel. And with me, I have two guests I'd like to welcome. The first is Celeste Shambrook and the second is Shawn Wilkey. Celeste, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm a senior associate at Maurice Blackburn Lawyers in Victoria. I practice in personal injury law, and I'm also the chair of the Victorian limb of Maurice Blackburn's Cultural Diversity Group.
Thanks, Celeste. And Shawn?
Yes, Shawn Wilkey. I'm a public servant, work for the Department of Defence in the APS and have worked in the Victorian government before and in sport in the AFL. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you both. Now, both of you, you're part of this panel because both of you, like myself, we do embed the work of diversity and inclusion in our day-to-day practice. So for me, it's very much a part of a consulting business that I have where I engage businesses and organisations on how to leverage the diverse talent often that's existing within their organisation when it comes to their team, but also to some extent how to use that same lens of inclusivity and relatability to increase their customer or their client-facing angle as well, because there's something that's often overlooked, I think, in a lot of work practices. And Celeste, I wanted to ask you first, do you think that the idea within the legal practice, do you think the idea and the notion of cultural diversity is achievable, I guess, initially, when you consider how sometimes, particularly in legal practices, what I know of it as a non-lawyer, I should state I'm not a lawyer, as a defence here, but, you know, for someone on the outside looking in, it's a very traditionalist ingrained profession where things have been done a certain way for the longest time. And there's a certain respect for that sort of aplomb that, you know, that governs the legal practice. There's a history, there's a recognition of a very almost, I wouldn't say insular, but a very respected way that things have always occurred. And that hasn't necessarily looked like a multicultural practice in any way. That we don't sort of perceive diversity and cultural diversity being a part of that traditionalist thinking. Do you think there's room for that, I guess, for that pivot in 2021?
Yeah, so I completely agree with you. The legal profession is a very traditional, very hierarchical, and really hinges on the idea of respect and authority. So certainly for people from the outside looking in, and also for participants within the legal profession, there is the impression that there's a set of rules, and we all love rules as lawyers. I certainly love a rule, and unspoken rules around standards of behaviour and the types of people that we want to welcome into our very special club. In Victoria, and I can speak to the Victorian experience, our Legal Services Commissioner has, for the first time more recently, asked lawyers what their cultural backgrounds are. 78% of our lawyers in Victoria were born in Australia, and the majority of lawyers are from Anglo-Saxon European backgrounds. So certainly I think the topic of diversity is a hot topic. What I would say in terms of making a case for diversity in the law is that our profession hinges on the administration of justice. I always, as a social justice lawyer, for me, values kind of underpin everything that I do. And I think that if we as a profession want to administer justice for the people that we serve, and we are a service profession, I think sometimes we can forget that as legal advisors, we are here to serve people, serve the community, that we need to pull ourselves into where we are and where society sits right now. Sometimes in the legal profession, there's talk about that diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do. And I find that that topic or statement a challenging one, because I don't think that we should, as intelligent, hardworking professionals, focus what we do or be motivated by what the right thing to do is. It should simply be that diversity and inclusion is the thing, reflects who we are, and should form part of our values as a profession. So that's my case for diversity in the legal profession.
No, thank you. And look, Shawn, you're not from a legal background, are you?
No.
So can you tell me, in your opinion, some examples of how you think cultural diversity can be a new concept in some workplaces, and how to bring that on in a way that still achieves, I guess, the end goal, the purpose of what that organisation is trying to achieve, keeping true to itself, but also at the same time being quite progressive in including what is in fact a greater representation of Australians?
Yeah, so I think I experienced something similar to perhaps what the dynamics in the legal profession when I was at the Carlton Football Club, a very traditional club within the AFL. But of course, it's been a really successful multicultural story over the years in terms of the players on its playing list, the fans and supporters that had sort of migrated through Carlton and the northern suburbs, and it flocked to the games through the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s. And then, of course, onto the corporate supporters and the business people that have made their way onto the Carlton's leadership over the years. So they've been very multicultural as a club, but very traditional. And I got there in 2012. And it was sort of around the same time they'd had a president and CEO change. So there was an appetite for change, and inclusion was given a priority, because both the president and the CEO saw the value of diversity, appreciated the history of the club, and sort of wanted to recapture its multicultural roots. So we went about implementing a range of things. First off, we engaged Professor Joe Camilleri, who might be familiar to some of the audience here, sort of as a strategic...
Not the musician, just so we're clear.
Yeah, not the musician, though.
Not the musician.
Yeah,
the academic.
Suspicion that he's okay. Yeah. No, he's a professor out at La Trobe University, and very sort of experienced in this field. So he was an advisor and assisted us develop a strategy. We did a wide-ranging consultation across sort of key multicultural community organisation leaders, our fans, our members. So we just did a big listening exercise to understand what the community was telling us, what we'd done well.
Can I stop you there, Shawn? Why would a football club decide to take on that mantle?
So it was about sustainable business growth. It was tied to the business objectives of the club. So it was clear and the AFL sort of knew this as well, and still know it. And I've got views, of the AFL as well as the club, Carlton, but they saw the business imperative. Like, Australia's demographics are rapidly changing, and it's no longer it's no longer acceptable to not be culturally competent. And so, that was part of the understanding that, for us to be successful, sustainable into the future, we needed to be more inclusive, more diverse, and more culturally competent. So that was probably the genesis. Then we went about, implementing a range of things. So, we went about rebuilding our relationship with the Victorian Aboriginal community, and in particular a formal apology to Sir Doug Nicholls when he was at the club as a player, literally 60 years prior, when the club had been racist, and he left the club, and the organisation had never formally recognised or acknowledged that. So part of it was going back into our history and righting some wrongs. So that was one of the first things we did. We then developed partnerships with sort of key multicultural agencies in the region. redesigned our community programs, tailored our communications, started engaging ethnic media. And then, of course, training and education was a big part of our workforce's development. So we made sure that cultural competence training was mandatory and was embraced well. And then finally,
that's a sizable shift from where you were to where you went in terms of reaching out in a very, I guess, concerted way to a cohort that you had probably historically not, including the apology. Did you see any uptake for the efforts that you put in?
Yeah, we certainly did. I mean, we weren't tracking, uptakes in sort of ticket sales or membership sales, but we certainly saw, impact in the media. So through our engagement, we could see that the message of Carlton as a multicultural club and as an inclusive club was starting to get out. The strength of our relationships were really, you could see that in the strength of our relationships and our ability to engage with government as trusted partners, as opposed to a corporate entity wanting to make money and, bring people to games and sell membership. So we saw a noticeable change in the way the club was perceived in both, the not-for-profit and the public sector. So, yeah.
That's an interesting case. I'm just thinking about how you've both demonstrated I think in Celeste, your example, you've demonstrated clearly the moral imperative of being more culturally inclusive in an organisational breadth. And Shawn, you've clearly showed me the business imperative of it, as well as the moral imperative in getting to that point. And for me, when I think about clubs and sustainability, you think about that social return on investment. And do you think both of you within the legal profession and within the football industry, you got a return on the investment that you put in by branching out into this more culturally diverse, I guess, business model? Celeste?
Yeah, I think the topic around return on investment and the business case for diversity is a really interesting one. I think that we all accept, or I hope that we all accept, that diversity and inclusion is good for business. But I was recently challenged by an article that the Harvard Business Review put out that talked about, well, what if it isn't? What if at the start it's not? You don't get return in a financial sense. Do your advocates and your investors, your ethical or emotional investors, then withdraw because they don't see the return that they were promised? Or what if a diverse and inclusive workplace simply continues to replicate the good outcomes that a non-diverse and inclusive workplace delivers? So I'm not sure where I sit on the idea of a return on investment, but I really like what Shawn was saying about sustainable practices that will help, for example, the club's growth and future, because I think that we are dealing with consumers in the law in particular that are very savvy and that will vote with their feet at some point in the future. And we also want to pull in people that truly stand for the things as a society that are important for most. So Black Lives Matter, that, the explosion that arose from that in terms of the exchange of ideas and concepts that we're challenging was really telling. I've got 3 children, two teenagers and a preteen, and the language that they are using now around anti-racism, diversity, inclusion, what they're seeing in the media, what they're consuming, they're really able to engage in an exchange that says they want what is important to them. So I do think we will get a return on investment when we start to, as one of our pioneers, Asmina Hussein, says, look like the Australia that we exist in. When our internal operations look and feel like Australia, I think there will be an inevitable return on that investment. But I also think that we need to consider sustainable behaviours, and diversity and inclusion has to play a part in that.
I'm going to lead into a question. You brought your children into this, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that as a pivot to Shawn. If our younger generation of Australians are now adopting more, I hate to use this word, but I'm going to, woke concepts and Okay. When it comes to understanding who they are, what their place in the world is, what it means to be a bystander if they see an injustice, if they're actually thinking in a way that's probably, beyond their years, even compared to when we were their age. Well, I was, that was a long time ago. What kind of onus do you think then that puts on institutions to keep up and to be held accountable? And so that, I know the new trend now is, when young people are applying for positions, not even young people, when anyone applies for a position in industry today, they can actually ask their employer, how are you tracking on the diversity and inclusion index at your workplace? Because then you're asked, what would you like to ask us as an organization? And people ask this, and a lot of younger people are asking this in a very confident way, that this is their entitlement to ask this, because they want to know that they will be heard and respected and included. Do you see workplaces keeping up with that momentum? Shawn, I was going to ask you.
I think some are. I certainly think that there's lots that aren't. It's hard. And just to pick up on Celeste's point before, I share her concerns about the return on investment. And some of the research I've done has shown that there's as much research out there that suggests homogenous teams can actually outperform diverse teams, which is why it is actually difficult to capture and harness the capability benefit from diversity if it's not done in a strategic and intentional way. So I think it's absolutely critical that organisations, or government and the private sector, are doing work in this space. They must. It's not only a moral imperative, I believe it is a business imperative. These institutions are set up to serve society. Like, the government is there to serve its people, and the market is there to serve people. And our community is diverse now. It is an incredibly multicultural country. And so, we need to catch up, and it's just unacceptable now that we don't see cultural competence as a fundamental sort of core competence, regardless of what business you're in or sector. So I think it is expected. I think that businesses are obligated, but I am encouraged, because I think there are lots of examples of really progressive Australian businesses and Australian government agencies and departments doing really good work in this space. But as I said before, there's also, I think, a long way to go.
Well, on that issue of doing really well in this space, you gave us the Carlton Football Club example, but can you give us another example where, cultural diversity in the workplace is manifesting in a really genuine way and not in a tokenistic way, like, wear a ribbon on Harmony Day, that one day you bring your international cultural food to the workplace, because that's when you can come out with your cultural stripes, but the rest of the time you don't feel that you can. Can you tell us how businesses can make it more meaningful and less tokenistic?
Yeah, absolutely. I might use the Victorian, I'll be specific, but just, in terms of what the Victorian government are doing, because it was a big shock for me going from the Victorian government into the Commonwealth government and seeing this difference in approach to cultural diversity and multiculturalism, and now being based in Canberra, it's different again. It's an international community here, but nowhere near the depth and breadth of multicultural community organisation and advocacy and vibrancy. So I think Victoria does it incredibly well. I think when I was...
I think Celeste, I would completely agree with you on that. Go on.
Look, and I suppose not everyone does it well. So I suppose I was going to use the treaty example, because I think the one example that I think the Victorian government is outshining all other governments and is really a beacon in the country is its work with our First Peoples and the commitment to treaty and self-determination. And I worked to support the Aboriginal community in driving the treaty process in the early stages. And that was a whole of government commitment from the Premier to the Minister down, and the Victorian Aboriginal community did an amazing job engaging across the state to lead to where we are now, which is we've got Australia's first treaty legislation passed in the government. We've got a First Peoples Assembly and now a Truth and Justice Commission established. And so there's lots of work to still do to end up with a treaty, but really encouraging to see that work. And I think that's an example of an area that is doing things well.
Good. And what about you, Celeste? Can you give us a substantive example of where you can see it's being done with authenticity as opposed to just the trimmings?
I'm a little bit biased, but I will speak to Maurice Blackburn, given that I've been there for a while. Look, we're a social justice law firm, so it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that diversity and inclusion is high on the list of our priorities in demonstrating who we are and what we're about. But for us, it's not just a tagline or a byproduct of a marketing campaign, for example. We have a national cultural diversity group whose role it is to keep leadership in the firm accountable to the commitment that they've made. We've got a diversity and inclusion steering committee that's made up of senior leaders in the firm across multiple pillars and areas of diversity and inclusion. We celebrate diversity, but we also have an all-in census that we ask our staff to voluntarily provide very precious information about their cultural backgrounds, their gender at work, sexuality, caring responsibilities, etc.
How often do you undertake those?
I think it's every 2 years, but don't quote me on it. We've just had our results come through recently, and it allows us to look at results, look at it against our goals, our strategic plan, and then consider how we are or aren't meeting the needs of our staff. So, for example, we've now seen that the majority of our staff were born in Australia. We have a lot of staff that speak languages other than English, but there's work that we need to do around engaging with staff and recruitment. Some of our goals that we want to measure ourselves against are around recruitment, whether it's blind hiring to reduce unconscious bias. I'm a really big fan of targets, so that's something that I'm personally very invested in, but it certainly takes it away from the tokenism of we all really love the Harmony Day lunches, and certainly that's one of my favourite parts of the year, but the use of data around diversity and inclusion has really helped us keep ourselves accountable at a senior leadership and strategic level.
And this idea, I'm just really curious about the data retention that you're creating by doing this audit. Is this something that you, as a firm, opted in for, or is this like a thing that's happening in the legal sector?
It's certainly not something that I've heard of. It's something that the DISC, Diversity and Inclusion Steering Committee, opted into, and it's something that we're really proud of. I think the great thing about something like a census is that it allows staff at all levels to provide candid answers around, do you feel that you can bring yourself to work? Do you feel safe to identify yourself as of a certain cultural background or a gender? And it's extraordinarily helpful for us when we're speaking with senior leaders to say, well, we can see that there's a real gap where we're missing in this sector. What are we going to do? What tangible measures can we take in order to bring ourselves up to where we expect ourselves to be? And then we also are using this data to compare ourselves to the census that also happened this year and really determine how we sit against real Australia, not just legal profession Australia.
And for me, I guess I'm using my diversity inclusion, lens here as well. With the data that you get, you're developing a map or a picture at least of where your firm is tracking in terms of its cultural breadth, multicultural breadth specifically. How does that help you in the way that you then engage with your client base? Is there a sort of payoff to saying, well, okay, this is what our diversity spread looks like. This is what the Victorian map looks like. How do we extrapolate the talent that we have here to optimize the outcomes in the client engagement? I mean, is that something that happens with the data that you have?
Absolutely, and I'd like us to do more with it. We all really love data and metrics when it comes to financials in business. I think, first of all, we've got a language toolkit. So we have a database where we connect staff who have certain language other than English, and those staff can be utilised for interpreting. But I think that there's more that we can do around being strategic. to match, for example, lawyers and legal assistants in areas where the language or the cultural background they have can connect in with clients. I mean, how valuable and amazing would it be if, as a non-English speaker, I can rock up to an office and just speak my native tongue to the person who's giving me trusted legal advice? As a cultural diversity group, we're working on ambassadors so that people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds can put their hand up to say, I would like to speak to my community and help figure out how we can meet their needs. So I think it can work inside and outside, but as a starting point, as an inside, that's what we've done.
It's a great case for cultural safety, both within an organisation for internally, but also client facing. That's great. I guess now pivoting on to leadership, because it's I don't think it's, talk about sustainability, Shawn, and you can have the best plans about how you're going to diversify an organisation and, you know, focus on cultural breadth and increase your targets and do all this. But if leadership is not on board, how do you make leadership see the imperative of taking on a cultural diverse lens as a priority, as a BAU issue, and not just as an afterthought that belongs to this one worker who does something, you know, once a month? I mean, how do you begin to make that behaviour change?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I mean, I suppose you got to use every tool and trick, you know, available to you, I think, and it really does depend on the unique context in which you're operating and the characteristics of the organisation and its situation in the marketplace or in the community. And so it will be different. You know, it will depend on the background and the attitudes, experiences of the board or the senior leadership group. And so I think there's multiple ways that you can, drive a change agenda. So if it's meeting people where they are, I think is, critically important. And we're all at different stages of our cultural competence journey. And so I think it's important, if you're in an organisation or you're trying to drive change, that you try and bring as many people along as you can. And so starting with leadership, I think, is critical, because I'm a strong believer that the old adage that the fish rots from the head down. And so I think it's fundamentally important. And, there's training and education, that should just be immediately brought to bear if there are concerns with the leadership's cultural competence. So 101 sessions, there'll be some that, are further advanced, and therefore, you shouldn't just subject everyone to the same sorts of messaging. But I think driving a change agenda, and I've had to work with leaders of all backgrounds and at all different stages. I mean, not of all backgrounds, like I can't count every sort of ethnicity on the planet, but a pretty diverse range of leaders, and so the ones that do get it or are culturally competent, they can really champion and be the voice for you. And so building that sort of coalition of the willing in the sort of leadership group to start off with is a great step, a great first step. Then ensuring the rest of the leadership can be brought up to a sort of a minimum standard. And then alongside that, I think of equal importance, a sort of really sort of strong reporting mechanism. So if there is misbehaviour or unacceptable behaviour from leadership, that there are safe confidential mechanisms that people at whatever level can raise those concerns, and that the organisation can deal with them and discipline if required, but sort of go to its policy on unacceptable behaviour or whatever it might be. So it's a bumpy road, and definitely starting with the leadership, I think, is really critical. But having mechanisms in place, so if leaders do start to err on the path, and there's always leaders out there that err, there's strong, robust systems in place to hold them accountable.
Well, you're from Canberra, so you probably know that better than most, I suppose. Celeste, when we talk about leadership and diversity, is it to do with the language and the approach? Do we talk about holding leaders to account or do we talk about bringing them on the journey? You know, there's a different way of doing it. Which way do you think is going to work better and why?
I think a challenge for us in the legal profession is that we are so good with our words, and there will be policy and procedure for any outcome imaginable. So I think that I agree, Shawn, leadership is critical. I have a pretty hardline approach. I think that leaders need to be actually educated. I'm tired of hearing about all the slideshows and the tick boxes to learn how to be culturally competent. I think that leaders need to be sat in a room and really confront their own biases. And I think an integral part of leadership training, promotion, appraisal needs to be confronting unconscious and overt bias. I think that there needs to be a lot of uncomfortable conversations and experiences. And I think that bad behaviour, you know, well, first of all, I think the great thing about the legal profession is you can use policy and values really well if you are an actor in the space instead of a decision maker. So at any law firm or in the legal profession, there will be great policy and procedure. So you can call out the values with superiors to say, this is what we value, how are we playing it out? But when bad behaviour occurs, I think that it is absolutely integral that the legal profession calls it out and takes an anti-racism approach. So not just an accountability approach or a consequences approach. Really hard line, we are anti-racist and this is how. You
said not just a consequences approach, but consequences do matter.
They do matter. And I think I agree it's a challenging topic.
Yeah.
But I think that leaders
it's also like the elephant. It's kind of the elephant in the room topic, isn't it? When you're talking about making a case for embedding cultural diversity in the traditionally, like you said, often archaic profession like law, where things have been done the same way for the last 200 years in a country, that's going to be a sort of difficult nut to crack. Right. So you're going to have to come in gently and bring it up nicely and position yourself in a way as an ally and as a friend, as someone who wants to do this for the good of the company, for the good of the people, and make the case. But you might then still be met with reluctance. Right. Meanwhile, you've got younger kids and younger people who are, you know, holding them to account and scrutinizing and saying, I'm only going to work in your place if I feel that it's safe and that I can feel respected and I feel like I've got pathways to promotion and mentorship. We're talking about diverse Australians here, just to be very clear. So at some point there's going to be an impasse because you'll have a hierarchy saying, well, no, because they didn't go to this particular school or they're not from this particular cohort. And that's our people.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think we can't, it would be wrong for us to just look up and say, well, leadership needs to change and push it down. We need to be passionate participants in our careers and also when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I've got to be honest, the biggest supporter in my career and a large reason I succeeded was because there was an older white male who I reached out to who championed me. And I'm optimistic. I believe that in every organisation there are powerful people who don't think it's the right thing to do. They just believe that diversity and inclusion is real life. So I think we're pushing up, and then someone will be pushing down, and we'll meet halfway in between in order to get the majority across the line.
That sounds ideal. I mean, Shawn, can you think of other practical measures to onboard diversity in the workplace?
Yeah, so I mean, Celeste mentioned targets. They are very galvanising for an organisation, and you know, they can also lead to perverse outcomes. So they're not the be-all and end-all, but I think they're important. How you design your job advertisements, you know, so you're attracting culturally diverse community members, where you're promoting those job ads. So not just your standard sort of sites, but reaching into multicultural community networks. Celeste mentioned champions. The role of champions and establishing those in an organisation can be incredibly effective. So your leadership, your senior leadership, it gives them a vehicle to buy in and advocate. Similarly, allies. So not just the senior management, because there is a lot of research that suggests that a lot of the resistance to cultural change comes from the middle management. And so reaching down into middle management's, critically important. I think the concept of the ally, that no matter what your level, you can support this agenda. Employee networks are very valuable as a way to provide a platform for the organisation to formally listen to its people and implement the changes that its workforce are suggesting. Training and education, we've already touched on. Celeste also mentioned that the individual that in her career that sort of assisted her and championed her. So the notion of like these opportunities and initiatives to work with talent within your organisation in a targeted way, to assist with building that, future pipeline or pipeline of leaders. So, we see the pendulum swing in terms of the representation of people from culturally diverse backgrounds in our senior leadership. And the events and days of significance we've spoken about, the Harmony Day, they can be tokenistic in some ways, but also important to be recognising those days that are really significant to the community and doing it in a genuine and authentic way. And then lastly, I think the monitoring, evaluation, and if possible, public reporting. So similarly to targets, they can be very galvanizing. When you've got to report this stuff publicly, that really does make people think long and hard. And I think one of the examples of that, which isn't in a culturally diverse setting, but the Department of Defence have published a Women in the ADF report for several years now, and it was off the back of some reviews into the mistreatment of women by the former Sex Discrimination Commissioner Elizabeth Broderick, and it led to a range of things. One of them was the public reporting on the experience and progress of women in the Australian Defence Force, and that's a resource that's published every year and is one of the only of its types in the world in terms of females' representation in defence forces. So public reporting, I think, and so to be able to measure what you're doing and hold ourselves to account.
Wow. Okay. Celeste, I'm going to go now to one of the questions from one of our one of our viewers, and that is, you mentioned that Maurice Blackburn has set up a DISC, a Diversity Inclusion Steering Committee. Can you give us some tips, for example, on advocating for in the workplace where there might be some support or some reluctance or varying degrees of reactions towards setting up something like that? How would you go about, like tip-wise, what would you suggest or recommend to any lawyers out there who are keen to be setting up or replicating a similar model in their workplace?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And certainly Azmina Hussain is the pioneer in our firm because she started the Cultural Diversity Group. So I can speak to her experience. I think, and the advice of my mentor, Steve Walsh, you've got to pick your passion. You've got to find a champion. Not everyone has to come on board, but they will after some time. So I really like the idea of blocking out noise and focusing on what's important to you. And almost certainly, when people see that the group are coming on board, they will be part of the cohort, whether they like it or not. But I think if we wait for everyone to buy into what we wish to do, then we're going to be waiting forever. Part of diversity and inclusion work is that it takes discretionary action. Certainly for our group in Victoria, at the start, there was a lot of discretionary work that needed to occur outside of our work hours where we do our legal work. But then after time, it's become embedded into everything that we do in a business development sense, in community work. Certainly when I speak to my peers about their performance, when I recruit, I ask about their view on diversity and inclusion and their work in diversity and inclusion. So I think we don't need everyone to come on board. You need one champion, and you just need to be passionate. And then the others, no doubt, will come to the party at some point.
Find your allies, get started, and the rest will come.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I hope that helps you, Arlo. That was Arlo's question. There's another question there, and I think I'll just, if you don't mind taking on this one as well. Celeste, do you feel there's a difference between the language of racial justice and cultural diversity and the frameworks for change they might imply? So this is a question from Grace, and she's also added, do you think it's better to use one or the other in a professional or corporate environment? So racial injustice or cultural diversity? That's such a
thoughtful question. I'm not sure that I can do it justice, Grace. Look, I'm all, racial justice is such an important part of who I am, what I am. So I'm always going to go on to the more, I think it could be a perceived more militant approach, racial justice. But to be frank, I think we in the legal profession, it's time for us to start being far more active. Tasneem, I think you mentioned last week, you would have expected that, 10 years ago, we might have been having this conversation around, how can we go about enacting change or speaking to senior leaders? It's too late. We need racial justice in the law. I think the framework for change that it implies is that this is not a choice. Cultural diversity is important, and I think it's implied that there are diverse segments of the community, but racial justice is something that, we all form part of race. Some of us are identified more strongly because of race than others, and justice these days is just such a common word, and I think it's completely acceptable for us to say that racial justice in the legal profession is a normal and valid and worthy pursuit.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, Celeste. Just using the words racial injustice is it's much stronger language. It's very direct. There's no sort of fluffing about, which you could get away with cultural diversity that can sound like a softer approach. And one is definitely softer and one is harder. But I guess the real question is it okay to use the hard terms now? This is 2021. We are grappling at a time when we know racial injustices rather are rife in the West, in particularly for minority communities. If the legal profession can't stand up and even use the terms, then how do the general public feel in terms of confidence when they need to approach legal authorities for help? If they're not even going to table the issue internally, how are they going to treat the issue externally?
And I'd say as well to that, that's where the education piece and really confronting bias and racism comes in when leadership are confronted with what they perceive to be the confronting words of racial justice. If we don't have the piece around what everyone's bias and racism is, because we've all got it, regardless of whether we believe we do or not, then that word racial justice is going to be triggering. But, to be frank, we are in an era where, you can live stream someone being killed because of the colour of their skin. So we should absolutely be able to talk about racial justice in the legal profession.
You're right. I mean, as they say, it's if you're uncomfortable hearing the words racial injustice, you should try experiencing it.
That's a you problem, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to get into a little bit more again, some practicals here. Shawn, I wanted to ask you, there's a quick question here from Kingsley. He's written, is the challenge more so in the institutional sized law firms as opposed with smaller operators when it comes to embedding this cultural change? So would some D&I initiatives be more effective from grassroots rather than top down? What do you think?
I think it needs to be both. I think the large players obviously have the scale advantage, and so they can bring to bear greater resources and, the role of peak bodies that can sort of do some of the heavy lifting and provide some of the sort of tools that can be used by the smaller organisations that mightn't have the the resources to be able to, develop their own policies, their own toolkits for their managers or their leaders. So I think both, but and also whatever can be brought together. I think the more we can work together in this space, the better. So, collaborating across industries, collaborating across sectors, collaborating within industries, is just so fundamentally important. And to get at this problem of exclusion, and I've got a director of diversity and inclusion role, so it's very broad. And when you sort of aggregate it up, like the problem we're trying to solve is the problem of exclusion, which is a wicked, complex problem that cannot be solved in traditional ways. And so it requires the collective effort of all parts of society, the community, the private sector and the public sector. And so I do see a lot of large organisations doing amazing work, but then that work staying sort of locked within that area, or amazing research being developed, but then because it's commercialised, it's not accessible to everyone. And so there's definitely, I think, benefit and opportunity for large and small. But what I would love is just to push that, working together in this, across sectors, across industries, and is really, I think, where the future lies for this space, because there's so many things that I've seen work in the organisations that I've been in that I think could be equally beneficial to small, medium and large organisations, but it's quite difficult to be able to sort of lift them up and take them with you or make them accessible because of, various sort of IP issues. But there's like I think an opportunity and a willingness to want to share. We've just got to create the sort of mechanisms to enable that sort of sharing to be easier. So hopefully that goes part of the way there. I know I probably didn't answer it completely.
It's a big one. Did you want to add to that at all, Celeste?
I think we've seen Maurice Blackburn really grow in scale over the years. I think being a smaller player can come in really handy when it comes to introducing and actioning change in this space. And I think the bigger we get, the harder it can be to institutionalize diversity and inclusion. So I think that from my perspective, larger institutions can learn from smaller ones, and the bright and innovative ideas often come in smaller spaces, I think, because there's less fear and more room to speak. And I agree with you, Shawn. I think that in the legal profession, we really need to work together to draw common ground around what we all believe is going to further the administration of justice. And the flow on from that ties directly into diversity and inclusion and meeting the needs of community.
And that kind of segues beautifully into the next question in a sense. So the question is, in terms of training, how do you build knowledge programs that gets the old schoolers, the old school thinkers engaged, rather than just seeing this as a tick box, but something that's substantive, that they can actually have an input and leave a footprint in?
It's a really challenging question, but I'm also a little bit radical in that I think that tenure for leaders is going to really motivate them to want to come to the table with the rest of society. So if we have leaders that are given a tenure of 3 years before they are either renewed, if they meet the objectives and the values and the goals of a firm, or turfed in favour of someone who is more progressive and able to bring in sustainable work practices that embrace diversity and inclusion, I think that will be a great motivator for them. But in real terms, when we know that most law firms are not going to introduce that sort of radical behaviour, I think we need to tie matters of diversity and inclusion into performance, directly into performance. And certainly in our firm, a topic that I'm floating is the idea of asking senior leaders to demonstrate in their appraisals opportunities they took to mentor across cultural or language or race or gender lines. I don't know, Shawn, what you've probably got some ideas about that too.
Do you want to add to that, Shawn?
Yeah, I'd echo all of Celeste's points and share those sentiments. I suppose a couple of things that I've seen work to really good effect are a concept called stories from the heart. And so, for particularly individuals that, might be of a demographic that, are low in cultural competence. So I've seen groups of senior leaders in traditional sectors, Anglo-Celtic background, sort of 40 to 60, male, not very culturally or diversity competent, just generally from traditional conservative backgrounds, participate in what they call either 5-on-5 or 10-on-10 sessions, which are common across a range of sectors, but it's basically 5 people with lived experience coming in and telling their story. And it's from the heart. It's very personal, and the individuals have been able to engage with the personal stories of these individuals within their organisation, and in several cases brought them to tears and fundamentally changed their view of this entire topic, after 1 hour of just listening. And so obviously, that can be hard to replicate, and it's sort of unfair in a way to sort of, put that on people to have to, basically, pour their heart out to raise people's awareness and consciousness in this space. But it is an example of something that I have seen work to good effect, and perhaps not that, but certainly stories from the heart. I think storytelling is a wonderful way to really, as an entree into this space, and something that I'm really interested in moving forward as a way to engage those people that might, be right at the beginning of their journey.
I think that's a really good point. It's that once you can actually see that there's someone who has a background that you didn't necessarily even assume that they had, simply because your relationship with them was purely on a professional level, and suddenly there's an opportunity for you to get an insight into them that humanizes them through a cultural lens that you probably would have never had reason to see if it hadn't been agendaed. I think it can be a very powerful thing. And I mean, Celeste, we talk about the power of storytelling and the impact of personal experience in shaping your activism or work in the space of DE&I. And I mean, can I be so bold as to ask you, I mean, what have been some personal takeaways or experiences that you've had that make this work that you do so important?
Oh, that's a big one, isn't it, Tasnmeen?
We're winding down here, so I just wanted to get some really insights.
Yeah. So I work with an extremely dynamic group of lawyers of all ages and backgrounds and experience. And when I see my peers who have no lived experience of what it's like to be from a culturally or linguistically diverse background, but are wholeheartedly and passionately pursuing diversity and inclusion work within and outside of Maurice Blackburn, I feel so heartened that the future is going to be bright, and that things are going to be okay, even compared to when I started in the law 10 years ago. And I'll talk again about my children, but when I see my children pointing out on the TV screen, oh my goodness, there's someone that looks like us, mummy. Or like, I'm reading The Hate You Give because it's about the lived experience of a Black girl living in the US in the middle of gun violence. I think, wow, things are really changing, and that's why we've got to keep doing this work, because there's a really optimistic cohort of young people that need us to be brave, and are in fact being more brave than most of us every day with the language they're using and the decisions that they're making.
Well, it's true. That's really powerful. Celebrating that adage, isn't it? You can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
When you create those opportunities, suddenly they go from being a dream to something that's aspirational. That's very, very powerful. I remember being at a forum several years ago. It was about dismantling the glass ceiling. It was a forum specifically dedicated to championing feminism and the opportunity for women to do better in the corporate world. But I noticed the room, there was about a few hundred people there, and the panelists themselves were also, there was 2 females and 1 male, but the room was 99% very Anglo-Celtic. And this was an issue about advancing the rights of women, and that's absolutely why I was there too. But I did notice that there was barely by 1 woman other than myself who represented a different cultural cohort. This is a couple of hundred people in the city, the CBD. And during the Q&A, the woman of colour who was in the row parallel to mine, she put her hand up and said, I'm all behind championing increased quotas and opportunities for women to take on leadership role and succeed. However, why can't we also champion cultural diversity in the same effort and breadth? I don't see representation here of what I know is outside this venue. And I'll never forget the woman at the panel. She actually pointed to her and said, we need to do gender first, then we'll get to culture.
Yeah.
I remember, I thought she was joking, but she was dead serious. And I thought to myself, how has sit down and wait your turn, honey, worked for feminism for the last 30 years, that's somehow an acceptable position to then to place cultural diversity? So for me, there's an imperative, do them in tandem. We can eat and chew gum. Surely we can be inclusive of sexuality, of gender, of race. We can do these things when we have the talent on board to be able to remind us and guide us. And like yourself and like Shawn, you're championing these issues within your space. Shawn, I'll give you the last minute to maybe share some insights about why you're passionate about working in this space.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping you might name and shame the individual then as well. But you didn't.
Too many lawyers in the room. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, look, I know we do have 1 minute. So look, I mean, I can't help but be inspired, by the stories that I hear and the people out there fighting for justice and equality. Like, it's a human fight. And, I just identify and resonate with it so strongly. I mean, I grew up with my sister who faced like horrible just bullying and discrimination on the basis of her ability and gender. She was trans from a very young age, and all the way up through to her adolescent years, and to the point where it started to get, criminal conduct started to be sort of involved. And so she's just had, such a horrible experience. And, I just want to make sure that, I want to do everything I can, to make sure that the world we leave, for our future generations, doesn't subject people to the same sort of, discrimination and horrible behaviour. When we're smarter now, we're more advanced, and we should, bloody know better. So, that's
no excuses, people. No excuses. Hashtag no excuses. Let's not be that person. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, Shawn, for your time. I know we raced through that 1 hour, but there was so much wisdom and so many pearls. I hope the listeners also took as many notes as I did. So thank you for your time.